department and police on the way.
Okay,
All right, thank you, ma'am. Fire?
Yes, it is. There are people in there. This whole house exploded.
Okay, we do have police and fire on the way. Were there people inside the house?
Yes, there are.
Robert William Fisher was, by all appearances, a devoted family man. A former Navy recruit and firefighter, Fisher built a life for himself in Scottsdale, working as a surgical technician and embracing his passion for the outdoors as an avid hunter and fisherman. Married in 1987 to Mary Cooper, the couple had 2 children, Brittany and Bobby, and settled into what seemed to be a typical suburban lifestyle. But beneath the surface, there were cracks in the foundation of the Fisher family, cracks that would soon take a devastating turn. Friends and neighbors described their marriage as volatile, filled with lots of arguments over money. Mary confided in others about her fears for the future, even taking a job as a security fund. By 2001, the relationship had reached a breaking point, with Mary reportedly considering divorce, something that weighed heavily on Robert's already troubled psyche. And on April 10, 2001, Robert finally snapped. That night, neighbors reportedly heard a heated argument from the Fisher home. Nothing out of the ordinary, but hours later the house erupted into flames, its violent explosion shaking the quiet Scottsdale neighborhood. Inside, investigators discovered a chilling scene: the lifeless bodies of Mary, 38, and their 2 children, Brittany, 12, and Bobby, 10, all still in their bed. Meanwhile, Robert was nowhere to be found, and Mary's Toyota 4Runner had also vanished, making Robert the primary suspect. Investigators pieced together the timeline. They determined that these murders were no random act, but part of a carefully calculated plan. After killing the family, Robert Fisher set the stage to destroy the crime scene. He disconnected the home's gas line, allowing the house to fill with gas overnight. To ignite the explosion, a candle was left burning in a deliberate act of sabotage. At 8:42 a.m. on April 10, 2001, the gas finally ignited, triggering a massive explosion that obliterated the home and set flames towering into the sky. The fire was so intense that it took hours to bring under control. It not only destroyed evidence but created confusion over who had survived. Fisher's carefully orchestrated plan bought him time to escape unnoticed, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable destruction and grief. The devastation of the fire and the horrific violence within the home painted a chilling picture of the lengths Robert Fisher went to in order to erase his past. The first major clue in the investigation came from an ATM surveillance camera at 10:43 the night before the murders. Robert Fisher was captured withdrawing $280. In the footage, Mary's Toyota 4Runner can be seen parked in the background, solidifying suspicions that he'd taken the car and fled the scene. This brief grainy image marked the last confirmed sighting of Robert Fisher and became a key piece of evidence in the early days of the investigation. The withdrawal in the car's absence pointed to a calculated escape plan, leaving investigators to piece together the horrifying evidence that had unfolded that night. With the ATM footage in hand, investigators had their first solid lead, but it wasn't enough to track Robert Fisher down. They scoured the area for more evidence, but no new breakthroughs emerged. As days turned into weeks, the trail started to stall, and Robert Fisher seemed to have vanished without a trace. The case, once filled with urgency, went cold. Or at least they thought.
April 20th, Mary's Toyota 4Runner spotted deep in the woods east of Young, Arizona, more than 100 miles north of Scottsdale. The SUV wiped clean, the family's dog Blue guarding it on the outside. Robert Fisher, nowhere in sight.
2 weeks later, deep in the Tonto National Forest, 100 miles away from the original crime scene, Fisher's wife's Toyota 4Runner was found abandoned. The vehicle was nestled in a remote area miles from any major roads, suggesting that it had been deliberately left to avoid detection. However, there was no trace of Fisher himself. The remote location and the condition of the vehicle hinted that Fisher might have escaped into the wilderness, but it also raised the chilling possibility that he'd carefully staged the scene to throw off authorities. They didn't realize it at the time, but finding the abandoned SUV would be the last solid clue investigators would get about Robert Fisher's whereabouts. With no new leads, authorities and the public were left to speculate on what could have happened to him. Over the years, countless theories have emerged, each offering a different version of how a man wanted for such a heinous crime could simply disappear without a trace. That brings us to Theory 1. One of the most prominent theories suggests that Robert Fisher might have been hiding in the vast network of caves near where his SUV was abandoned. The area surrounding the Tonto National Forest is known for its rugged terrain and extensive cave systems.
What we're standing on is literally honeycombed underneath us, and it runs for miles down there,
making it an ideal location for someone looking to vanish. Fisher's background as an avid outdoorsman lends credibility to this idea. He was skilled in survival techniques, familiar with the wilderness, and could have used his knowledge to live off the land, avoiding detection. Despite multiple searches of the area, the dense landscape and complex cave networks make it nearly impossible to be certain whether Fisher ever took shelter there. Theory 2 stays on the same track. Some speculate he could have headed to Alaska, drawn by its vast wilderness and remote communities where he could live off the grid. Fisher's survival skills would make Alaska a viable option for him to remain undetected. Alternatively, others believe he may have escaped to South America, where it's easier to disappear within less regulated border systems and regions with sparse law enforcement oversight. It is also important to note that the crime occurred before 9/11, a time when airport security and international travel were far less monitored than they are today. With looser restrictions and less advanced surveillance technology, it's entirely possible that Robert Fisher could have fled the country without raising suspicion. A third theory states that Robert Fisher may have sought refuge on Native American lands, where law enforcement jurisdiction can be more complex. The Toyota was discovered less than a mile from the Fort Apache Indian Reservation. Authorities followed a set of footprints leading onto the reservation but uncovered no sign of Fisher. Some believe that he could have taken advantage of the sovereign status of these territories, knowing that local authorities might be restricted in their ability to conduct searches without the cooperation of tribal law enforcement. And finally, Theory 4. The final theory states that Robert Fisher may have planned his escape with meticulous detail, storing a bike near the scene, using it to flee the area via unmapped trails. The vast network of hidden paths and trails surrounding the discovery site of his car would have provided ample opportunity for him to vanish without leaving an obvious trail. With no sightings, leads, or evidence to contradict this possibility, it remains one of the most plausible explanations for how Fisher disappeared so completely. Despite the lack of new evidence, Robert Fisher's name and face remained prominent in the years following his disappearance. In 2002, he was added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list, a designation reserved for the most dangerous and elusive criminals. His profile described him as armed and extremely dangerous, a chilling reminder of the brutal crime he left behind. Over the years, countless tips flooded in, but one stood out, a lead about a man in Canada who bore an uncanny resemblance to Robert Fisher. In 2011, authorities acted swiftly, tracking the man to his home near the Canadian border where he lived with his girlfriend. The man shared Fisher's height, weight, eye color, had a similar scar on his lower back, and was even missing the same upper tooth Fisher was missing, making the resemblance impossible to ignore. Hope surged as Canadian officials arrested him, believing they may have finally found their fugitive. But after fingerprint testing and comparing records from his time in the Navy, investigators confirmed the truth. The man was not Robert Fisher. In 2021, after nearly 2 decades on the list, Fisher was quietly removed, not because the FBI believed he was no longer a threat, but because they wanted to focus resources on more active cases. Even so, his story continues to haunt investigators, and his crime remains one of Arizona's most infamous cold cases. The hunt is still on for one of the most wanted men in America.